Wow. Thank you so much for turning out. Even after my Facebook ad was censored for being a social issue. But then I appealed and we won. So, but thank you so much. It's really a sad anniversary today because it's the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. And as we all know, most of us in this room at least very much appreciate how 9/11, quote unquote, changed everything. And that's because there were individuals who had longed for the new Pearl Harbor. And when they did get something that was going to be traumatizing to the American public, they said, like Rahm Emanuel, don't ever let a catastrophe go to waste. And again, they wanted to go to war in the Mideast. They had a whole project to go to war, perpetual war, it turns out to be. And initially it was 7 countries and ending with Iran. They never got to the final one exactly, but they did some assassination and everything. So the other really sad anniversary today is the Chilean democratic government was overturned 50 years ago today. Allende, and then they set up a torture, dictator of Pinochet. So here we are on these sad anniversaries. I really wanted to introduce Craig Murray. And I thought about it, and I found these great quotes. So you're just going to have to suffer through a few quotes, and then I'm going to quickly tell you what he had to do to get here today, which is incredible. But okay, you guys, if you read, you've probably heard these before, but they're very meaningful to Craig, to Julian Assange. The first quote is from Chris Hedges. A society that prohibits the capacity to speak in truth extinguishes the capacity to live in justice. That's something we need to understand. I work for the Justice Department, for heaven's sakes. And now we're not allowed, we do no longer have the capacity to speak in truth. You're going to be prosecuted and put in prison, and it's horrible. Here's my second quote. It's also by Chris Hedges. He scores on these great quotes. We cannot use the word hope if we refuse to face the truth. All hope rooted in self-delusion is fantasy. I know we like to believe fairy tales, but that's, it doesn't help. Okay, this is another one of my favorite ones. I used to always use this quote, and then I almost forgot the guy's name. How many have ever heard of Miguel de Unamuno? Anybody heard of him? The Spanish? He said, I think he ended up persecuted as well, unfortunately. He said, the greatest height of heroism to which an individual can attain is to know how to face ridicule. Better still, to know how to make oneself ridiculous and not to shrink from the ridicule. Okay, that actually defines Julian Assange, Craig Murray, and a few others that whistleblowers that I've been fortunate enough to get to know over the years. Okay, this quote is long, and I was cautioned not to read the whole thing, but I might. I have somebody in the audience who actually is one of these people that has conscientiously objected to war since he was a young man and sided with human rights advocates all over the world. And he wants to tell you about this quote from Socrates that Plato wrote.
Good evening. My name is Gary King. I'm from Fridley, and we've had an Amnesty International chapter for 46 years. And Amnesty has a lot to say about Julian Assange. Some of the quotes are on the petition back there and here. So you can go there and get more things on it. However, I think Julian Assange epitomizes exactly what we call a prisoner of conscience. A person who actually has not used violence and who is trying to speak their mind, and then the governments go after him and kill them. And I'm a little excited now because 2 days ago, a guy I knew, my 15th acquaintance, was murdered in the Philippines by their government. So a lot of this stuff happens. But certain to Socrates, let me just mention the 3 reasons they wanted to kill him. He was put to death in 399 before the Common Era. He was 83 years old. He'd been a philosopher his whole life. And he taught Plato. And Plato taught Aristotle. So this is the start of philosophy. This is the start of ethics. So they said 501 people in the jury, and they said, oh, you're going to have to die. And he said, well, look, I'm accused of corrupting youth. I'm a philosopher, I confess, and I go around to people and talk to them. And if any of you, I've been doing this for 70 years, so if any of you who were corrupted when you were young are now powerful, are now at the height of your career, then would you please step up and tell me how I corrupted you? Then they said, oh, you're following the wrong gods, you're following demons. And he says, well, you know, when I was younger, I went to the oracle, which in those days was everything about religion. The gods speak, and the oracle said that I was the smartest guy in the world. I was the wisest person. And he said, I thought, whoa, that's interesting news. So he went around for years, decades, and he went around to try to find a smarter person. And he said, I went to the leaders of our country. I went to the wealthy, successful people, and I talked to them, and I didn't find one of them was wiser than I was. And he said, then I went to the poets. You know, the poets write some pretty darn good things. He said, I went to poets, and I talked to them, and although they are perfect in what they do, they don't have a big picture, they don't have a full philosophy. They're no smarter than I am. He said, then I went to the craftsmen. They're building wonderful ships. They're building amazing buildings, still standing. They're doing all this stuff, and I spoke to them, and they weren't any wiser than I am. So he said, I am following what God told me. The oracle said, you're wise. I went around and I tried to find out more about that, and I did not find anybody. And then the last thing they wanted to do, they said, okay, we want you to stop. We want you to stop what you're doing. And if you will sit down and shut up, we'll let you live. And he said, you know, I'm 83 years old. I've been doing this my whole life. And I don't need a couple more years of life. I just need to be true to myself and to the gods. Yes. And that's exactly what prisoners of conscience do, and that's exactly why they're put to death all the time. So.
For all the prisoners of conscience, and there are some in this room, and actually one on stage here, I had, one more quote. Oh my gosh. Last one, and this one is from Free Speech. I don't know who this is from because I didn't write the name down. Here's the quote. Wendell Holmes wrote, a Supreme Court judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He wrote for the minority in one of these losing freedom of speech cases. And he said, writing for the minority, Holmes presented a new judicial philosophy for regulating speech, in which ideas, good or bad, benign or dangerous, I'm going to add misinformation, quote unquote, are free to compete in the marketplace of ideas. The ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, wrote Holmes, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. Okay? It's really hard hard to understand this now in our very manipulative, controlled corporate media. But you know, the marketplace, some of them aren't such good ideas. But unless you're calling for fire in a crowded theater, by the way, we're in a firehouse. So, you know, but anyway, unless you're doing that, honestly, you've got to have it. We can't be censoring social issues, whatever. So this brings us to our current prisoner of conscience, Julian Assange. Craig Murray has sacrificed a lot, and just a little bit of his history. We go all the way back to 2005, when he was a British ambassador, and he witnessed some really, what I said in the blurb, I said serious instances of abuse. But it was worse than that. I just wanted Facebook to let me put the ad, so I tried to tone it down. He witnessed some really bad torture in Uzbekistan. And guess what? After 9/11, everything changed. So torture was going on in a lot of countries. And we gave Craig the Sam Adams Award for integrity in intelligence because he didn't keep his mouth shut. He spoke out. There's a book, it's out of print now, but it's called Murder in Samarkand, if I'm pronouncing it right. And he got all kinds of, persecution, and we gave him the award for integrity in Washington, D.C. Ray McGovern kind of organized it, and I was there. And so that goes back to 2005. Then later, I'm trying to think of all our meetings up, but we met in Oxford, England, and we actually put Julian Assange up on the screen in it's that place where they have the famous debate. It's called the Oxford Union. You sometimes see it on British TV. And so we had this very famous place, and we had Julian Assange up there on the screen. And also, Craig organized a group of us kind of whistleblower types, and we all went into the Ecuador embassy and met Julian Assange. I think that was before they were surveilling all of us at the time, luckily enough, because I had a glass of wine in my hand. But anyway, then what else? There's a few other things that we've met up over the years. I don't remember all of them, but the truth is, this is a extremely decent person who has been on the inside of a lot of officialdom. And, we have this very great opportunity to hear his story and to tell you why we all need to work so much harder to free Julian Assange. Oh, that's what else he did. He covered the entire trial, the extradition trials of Julian Assange, with Assange's father. He went in there every day and listened and got no sleep for days on end. Okay, welcome Craig Murray.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you very much. One of my peculiar eccentricities is I don't like microphones. If you look back at the great orators of the past, they managed to speak to thousands of people before the microphone was invented. And I reckon that I still have lungs and vocal cords and aren't in particular need of electronic enhancement. There may be parts of me that could do with enhancement, but my voice is not one of them. So if it doesn't work for anyone, if at any stage you're not hearing me, I'll move over and attempt to use it. I prefer to try to start without the microphone.
You're loud and clear in the back.
Good to hear. The second thing is, most of you are familiar with the concept that if your car runs out of gas, or nowadays of electricity, your car no longer goes. Well, I'm a Scotsman, and if my whiskey glass runs out, I may stop talking. if people see that danger at any stage during the talk, you are welcome to remedy it. And also, I'm very open to questions and I hope discussion at the end. Don't feel that you're limited until the end. If I say something that you think is rubbish or with which you heartily agree or whatever, feel free to interrupt. Feel free to jump up and heckle, as we say in Scotland. Shout out your opinion. I'll even shut up and let you talk. It may give me a chance to get another whiskey. But do feel free to talk. And the last of these kind of housekeeping announcements is I never write a speech. Partly because I'm lazy, and partly because, mostly, I always think, if I don't know what I'm going to say next, you've no idea what I'm going to say next either. And we're all in this state of mutual excitement. What the hell's coming now? Normally this works. Sometimes it results in a kind of muddled chaos of disjoined thought. Let's hope this is one of the days it works, but we will get to it. And as I say, if I do appear to be talking complete nonsense or to have stuttered to a halt, feel free to cover it up for me by getting up and making one of those contributions I was suggesting you make. I want to talk about Julian. I'll start by saying a little about myself, which Colin introduced, because it explains why I know Julian and where I come from, if you like. I was in the British diplomatic service for 22 years. For 6 of those years, I was in what's called the senior management structure of the British diplomatic service. We don't have political ambassadors in the UK, or at least extremely few. It's a different system. Ambassadors are not political appointments. You work your way up the diplomatic service until you become an ambassador as a career diplomat. And I would say, at the time I was appointed, I was our youngest ambassador. My career was going rather well, and I enjoyed it. Nobody thought of me as anybody who was particularly moral or driven by human rights or liable to be a troublemaker. I seem to be a good, I wouldn't say corporate player because you're working for a state entity, but I seem to be a good team member as far as they were concerned. I went to Uzbekistan and I discovered that in this country, which I had instructions as an ambassador to support as our ally, terrible things were happening. And the context of this is that Uzbekistan joins Afghanistan to the north. It has a border with Afghanistan. I arrived there in 2002. And just shortly before I arrived, we had invaded Afghanistan together with the United States and other countries. Uzbekistan was providing an airbase to the American government and an airbase to the German government to support operations in Afghanistan. So my remit was to support the Uzbek government. That was unequivocal. But the Uzbek government was a terrible dictatorship, an absolute totalitarian dictatorship, something along the lines of North Korea, that kind of country. On top of which it was practicing torture on an industrial scale. It kept itself in power by widespread use of torture. And forgive me, this is not pleasant, but you should know, one of the earliest cases I learned about was that of a gentleman who'd been tortured to death. His body was returned to his mother for burial. She, being a brave old lady, got photos taken of the body as it lay on the kitchen table, detailed photos. I sent those photos to the pathology department of the University of Glasgow, and the pathologists there were able to do a report which said he had been boiled to death. He had been boiled alive. Before that, his fingernails were pulled out, he was beaten about the face, and he had been immersed in boiling liquid, not splashed with boiling liquid, there was a clear tide line around the upper torso and upper arms where he had been immersed in boiling liquid. And that, that's what we're talking of here, of torture. We're not talking of borderline torture. We're talking undoubted torture, which was bad enough. But I then discovered that the CIA and MI6 in coordination with the CIA, because the two agencies share all their material, were getting intelligence from this torture. They were producing regular intelligence reports from tortured detainees, and the gist of the reports was all the same. The gist of the reports was that the person tortured had confessed to membership of Al-Qaeda and had named other people as members of Al-Qaeda. These other people were always, of course, opponents of the Uzbek government, dissident opponents of the Uzbek government. And I knew that this was just untrue. I was there in the country. I had my own networks of informants and contacts. I travelled around and met people myself very widely. And Al-Qaeda had virtually nil, quite possibly actually nil, support or organisation in Uzbekistan. This was creating an Al-Qaeda threat that did not exist. And I'll give one example I'd like to give to illustrate this. And that example was of one of these intelligence reports from the CIA, mentioned these Al-Qaeda members in Tashkent, and one of them was an old professor that I actually knew. I not only knew him, I'd had dinner with him in his home. And this old professor, who the CIA said was in Al-Qaeda, was a Jehovah's Witness. Now, there are not many Jehovah's Witnesses in Al-Qaeda. I'm willing to believe that Al-Qaeda don't even try and recruit Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm sure the Jehovah's Witnesses would try and recruit Al-Qaeda. But it's just obvious nonsense. But why? That's the question. Why this false intelligence? Well, the false intelligence was to justify the United States government support for the Uzbek government, despite the fact it's a terrible dictatorship. And why was the United States government supporting the Uzbek government? Well, partly because the United States government was being given an air base to operate into Afghanistan. But then you have to ask, why did the United States government want to occupy Afghanistan anyway? Perhaps a more interesting question, which is that Uzbekistan, which has substantial supplies of oil and gas, had at that time signed a contract for its oil and gas with a company called Enron. and another company called Unocal, of which George Bush Sr. was a director, was to build a pipeline from Central Asia over Afghanistan down to the Indian Ocean to supply the oil and gas to be supplied by Enron. And it was all about corrupt hydrocarbon contracts. That's actually what was behind the whole damn thing. And I saw all this, and I thought, why am I doing this for a living? This is not me. I did not get born into this world and move forward in order to help this kind of thing. And the torture element in particular, to me, was unconscionable. And it seemed to me incredible that we could be accepting this evidence from torture. And I tried internally everything I could to stop it, using all in, if you like, memoranda and cables of protest, all of which were classified top secret. And we had a series of meetings, including a meeting I was summoned back to with the Foreign Office Chief Legal Advisor, at which I was told that it is not illegal for us to get intelligence from torture as long as we don't do the torture or specifically ask that the individual be tortured. And at that stage I'd had enough, and after substantial conflict with my employer, I went public. I leaked documents showing all this to the Financial Times.
Yes.
And that was, I think, the first time that the general public got to know of the Extraordinary Rendition Programme. I think I was the first person to leak the Extraordinary Rendition Programme. I was called a liar in Parliament by the Secretary of State. I was called a liar and a fantasist. They claimed the Extraordinary Rendition Programme did not exist, but I had made it all up. They came up with charges against me of alcoholism, how can they say that? Sexual misconduct and other things. They leaked unpleasant details of these entirely false charges to the tabloid newspapers on purpose to try to destroy my reputation. They did all the things they do routinely to whistleblowers, which are exactly the kind of thing they tried to do to Julian Assange with these ludicrous charges in Sweden. They tried to destroy you, they tried to undermine your reputation. And they did it to me before I'd even gone public. I immediately went public in retaliation, if you like, in the need to get out the truth. For me, there was a relatively happy ending compared to many whistleblowers, in that as they could, I mean, all the allegations against me were entirely untrue. And I was suspended for 4 months while a formal investigation was carried out, at the end of which I was cleared of all allegations. And they said to me, if we give you 7 years' salary, will you resign? If you'd said that in the first place, so they gave me 7 years' salary, and I resigned on condition I sign a non-disclosure agreement. But, and this is fascinating, they forgot to send me the non-disclosure agreement. They sent me the money before they sent me the non-disclosure agreement. And then they phoned me up and said, you didn't sign the non-disclosure agreement. So I said, I haven't got it, I haven't received it yet. They said, oh, you will sign it, won't you? And I just laughed. So there you are. Governments are not always as smart as they think they are. Now I am telling you all about it. But that's where I come from. And it was the end of a career I loved, and it opened up many questions, of course. Among them, I worked with many fine people, really good people, who were my friends, who were my social circle, who all knew what I knew. But nobody else resigned, nobody else blew the whistle, nobody else stood up in my support. Privately, they all sent me messages, yeah, great, yeah, go for it. Everyone else just wanted to keep their jobs, and that's, of course, how they do it, how the whole Extraordinary Rendition and Torture Programme worked. It wasn't run by terrible, evil people. It was run by ordinary, nice people with families who you can work with and know, and people, at the end of the day, want to keep their jobs and want to keep their position in society. And I know that, of course, is only the same perception and it's the banality of evil, but I've seen it, and I've seen it operate, and I've seen good people go along with terribly, terribly evil things, which tells us something about how the persecution of Julian becomes possible. And I want to think about the persecution of Julian in detail, but I want, before that, just to sketch out a few thoughts about where we stand in society now, today. Because it's a tremendous example, if you like, of where we are. But Colleen is trying to put out an advert for a talk which says the talk is about freedom of speech and censorship, and Facebook censors the talk. That's, I'm in the dead. astonishing. And that is where we are. There's so much control, and the control is getting worse. And partly that control comes through the gatekeeping role of corporate media, where so much... When I first started my own blog, nearly all the traffic came from other blogs, other people linking to me, and that's how people found my site, or they came direct. Gradually that changed, and until we reached the stage a few years ago when 90% of traffic came from Facebook and Twitter. When I wrote the articles reporting the first week of Julian's extradition hearings, which was held in Woolwich Crown Court at Belmarsh, I was getting 6 million viewers a day coming to my blog, 90% of them through Facebook and Twitter, to read those reports. The court adjourned for 3 or 4 months and then resumed at the Old Bailey. I started producing exactly the same kind of daily reports, exactly the same place, and my readership fell from 6 million a day to 60,000 a day, because Twitter and Facebook had both turned off the tap and were not showing people the tweets and the Facebook posts linking to those articles. And the ability of the corporate gatekeepers to control the narrative is extremely dangerous, and not something, I think, which we foresaw at the time when WikiLeaks first became an apparently huge breakthrough for freedom of information and the public's right to know. The world has moved on. And we now live in a world where the freedom of expression is not held as the automatic value it was held as 20, 30 years ago, and particularly among the young. I speak in a lot of universities. I have been speaking in a lot of universities. And it is increasingly common for the university to stop you speaking because somebody may be offended by your opinion. I've had universities attempt to stop me speaking on Julian Assange because of my opinion on trans rights, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the subject. And actually, strangely enough, they've done that on the basis of an opinion on trans rights they presume I hold, which I don't actually hold. But even imagining what my position is, they're wanting to ban me for having a position I don't have. And that's really, really strange, where not only are we moving from freedom of speech to freedom of thought into being banned for having thoughts you don't have. This has become, but the use of these wedge issues, and trans rights is one such wedge issue, COVID is another such wedge issue, 9/11 is another such wedge issue. And this strange societal acceptance, again, particularly among younger people, but not only among younger people, that you have to agree with somebody on everything, or you should cut them off. That, you may agree with someone on a whole range of issues, but unless somebody agrees with you on every single issue, then they're obviously a very bad person. It's this lack of respect for intellectual capability and intellectual debate and discussion.
Yep.
I have friends who are conservatives. I'm ashamed, but I do. I have friends of all kinds of different opinions, and they are my friends. I don't choose my friends for their political orientation. And in fact, I think if I were to spend my whole life talking with people who agree with me politically, that would be very dull. What would you talk about? It's good to talk and have friendly disagreement with people on different issues. George Galloway is a friend of mine. I've known him since he was 18 years old. That's not true. I've known him since I was 18 years old. George is a lot older than me. I want to get that on the record. And George and I are on absolutely differing sides of the Scottish independence debate. I'm a campaigner for Scottish independence, George is against it. And many of my friends are aghast that I even speak to him because he has a different opinion on that subject. Pluralism, and if you like, the marketplace of ideas, and the idea that there's no one slate of approved ideas, every one of which you have to agree to, is a disappearing value. And we need to reclaim it. And it's very difficult to fight the campaign for Julian Assange in a society in which free speech is in itself an increasingly derided concept. And that's the difficult background we have. And incidentally, the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote, which Colleen gave, was in itself almost a direct quote from On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, which is a wonderful book, which I strongly recommend everyone to read. People, we should all read more. And the two books which have, more than any others, shaped my own intellectual thought are On Liberty by John Stuart Mill and Imperialism, a Study by J.A. Hobson. And if you read Hobson, who was the next generation from Mill, but he was another English liberal philosopher, not socialist, liberal philosopher. If you read Hobson, his analysis of the military-industrial complex and the way that perpetual wars overseas and territorial acquisition overseas benefits only the ruling and military classes and the arms industry, and does not benefit the ordinary working class at all. In fact, there's a net drain on the ordinary working class. That's a fantastic analysis which remains true to this day. And Hobson, I believe, was the first person to actually make it and articulate it. So there you are, two things you might take as reading material away. I'm not, of course, assuming you haven't already read it. So to come on to Julian, the case of Julian Assange is an abomination. The case against Julian Assange is an abomination. Here you have a brave man, a publisher, who pioneered this use of the internet and this use of protecting sources by encrypting material, which seemed to open the way to a new citizen access to direct information on what they're going to do, and empower ordinary people in a way they've never been empowered before. But led to, not just in the UK and the US, but right across the globe, revelations about what people's governments were doing, which fundamentally revolutionized political relations in many states. And nobody has ever denied that Julian Assange published true information. There's never been any serious dispute that what Julian published was entirely true. He published the truth. And he's being persecuted for it. He's being prosecuted for enabling and empowering ordinary citizens of states. And he's being prosecuted because there's nothing the people who rule states hate more than empowered citizenry. They don't want empowered citizens. They want serfs, bluntly. That's what they want, to feed the power structure, to feed the billionaires, and to feed the military-industrial complex. Julian was seen as a great threat to that. So they've come up with this persecution, where he's being charged under the Espionage Act as espionage, merely for possessing and publishing classified information. The act of publishing classified information has never been taken as espionage. No publisher's ever been charged with that. As a whistleblower, I was a whistleblower. When I gave that information to the Financial Times, I was fully accepting I may be prosecuted for this and may go to jail. I was prepared to make a greater good defence in court and trust my luck. But I was expecting to take the responsibility. I would never have expected the editor of the Financial Times to be prosecuted for publishing information he was given by a source. The effect of that is the absolute end of the very notion of media freedom. And it's astonishing that most of the media are so servile to their corporate bosses that they don't see it. That, to me, is astonishing and appalling. But not only do we have that as the basic problem with the whole concept of Julian's prosecution, we have elements in his prosecution which beggar belief. One of which is the fact that the CIA secretly videoed through this agency, UC Global, which was pretending to provide security to Julian, but actually was doing the opposite. The CIA secretly videoed Julian's conferences with his defense counsel, absolutely in breach of attorney-client privilege. Now, there is no other case in the history of American jurisprudence where if the state had secretly videoed the defendant's conferences with his defense counsel, that would not have the case thrown out instantly. That would be enough. In any democracy in the world, that would have a case thrown out instantly. It has not been thrown out in this case, because it's not a genuine case. It's not an actual legal case. And I think the reason, the ostensible reason it has not been thrown out will really astonish you. The CIA, the American government has accepted it did this. It is not denying it did this. And the official story is the CIA videoed the conferences with Julian's legal counsel, but it did not show the video to anybody. That's very interesting. I mean, this operation will have cost probably millions of dollars to pay UC Global to do this, to set it all up, to set up the secret cameras, everything. If I were an American taxpayer, I would want to know why the CIA is spending millions of dollars on material it does not intend to use. What would be the point of that? Where's the value for money in obtaining videos of Julian's conferences with lawyers and then looking them in a cupboard and never looking at them? Who actually, in their rational mind, would believe that is in the least plausible? Of course it's not. It's just obvious bullshit. But the judge accepts this. That's fine. And I have no doubt the US court judges will accept this explanation as well. Oh, yes, you went to all this trouble, then you didn't show anybody the video. That's fine. Similarly, when Julian was removed from the Ecuadorian embassy, all his papers were seized. All his defense papers were seized. They were taken to Ecuador, to Quito, and there in Quito they were handed over to the FBI. So not only do they have videos of his defense conferences, they have videos of his written defense they had in advance. And again, that's not denied by the US government either. And funny enough, they didn't actually ever answer that one. Because who would the FBI can't say who gave it to no one else, because the FBI are the operative agency that would use it. But again, that kind of remarkable, incredible legal discrepancy, legal embarrassment, has had no judicial effect. Nil, zero. The very extradition treaty under which Julian is being extradited, the UK-US extradition treaty of 2003, states directly there shall be no political extradition. And the United Kingdom courts have ruled that that doesn't matter, because that particular clause of the extradition treaty has not been incorporated into UK domestic legislation. So that the United Kingdom government is not bound by the extradition treaty itself. That's an astonishing argument. I mean, firstly, you're not bound by this treaty you signed, but the treaty is the executive instrument carrying out the extradition. How can both of those things be true? And secondly, you are arguing that the United Kingdom government is not bound by treaties it has ratified. So why would anybody ever trust the United Kingdom government again when it signs a treaty? Although actually, why anybody would ever trust the United Kingdom government is a much wider question. But these kind of appalling discrepancies have been the logical inconsistencies and incredible judicial bias have shown there is no genuine legal process. The legal process is a charade. It's a theatre. And the sole use of the legal process from the point of view of the state is for them to make Julian's demise a long-term, drawn-out public execution in which the crushing power of the state is seen as used to humiliate, to ridicule, and eventually to destroy this man. And his appearance as an increasingly bad help, obviously bad help, to the state where at times he could not understand anything that was happening around him. In this armoured glass box at the back of the courtroom where he couldn't even communicate with his own defence attorneys and at times could not hear what was being said in the courtroom. The whole point of that is the theatre of the crushing power of the state, and this is how we will destroy you if you oppose us. That's the point of this entire thing. I would despair, and I worry terribly for my good friend Julian, I would despair utterly were it not for the fact that we do still have so many very good and decent people like those who are gathered in this room. And I've been meeting different gatherings around the United States this last 10 days who see this, who do oppose it. At the moment, that feeling is kept under, partly because the narrative against Julian has been so strong. And what is the narrative they use against Julian? Well, the primary one is that he endangered lives of people by revealing names. And the answers to that are rather complex, which is not easy when you're trying to get over snappily on media the answer to the simple claim that he endangered American lives. The first part of the answer is that the United States government has never claimed that any specified individual was harmed by WikiLeaks revelations. And in fact, even in the extradition documents, Deputy Attorney General Kronberg states that there is no evidence of a specified individual being named. And another part of the argument is what Dan Ellsberg said when he gave testimony in the inquiry, where he said that 1 million people died in the Afghan and Iraq wars and 27 million people were displaced. And that was a result of illegal war and invasion, 1 million dead and 27 million displaced. Even if you could prove that an individual was harmed as a result of the WikiLeaks revelations. You've got to balance it in the scale of what they revealed and what they were trying to stop. And anyway, amidst all that death and all that destruction, how can you possibly say that any particular harm to an individual was caused by WikiLeaks and not passed upon the world? And Daniel Ellsberg spoke very powerfully to the court when he said that. And let me tell you something else about how terrible those extradition proceedings have been. Thank you. I can now happily finish this without fear.
All right.
Your ESG score just went up.
You would like to criticise it, it's my national culture. Daniel Ellsberg, at the time he gave evidence, was 89 years old. 89 years old. I'm proud to say Daniel, like Julian, was a friend of mine. And Dan was slated by the court to give evidence at 2:30 p.m. And it was pointed out to the court that 2:30 p.m. in the UK was 5:30 a.m. in California. Is that right? It was some terrible time in the morning. And that Daniel was an elderly gentleman and would have difficulty preparing. And they asked to put it off until 8 a.m. Californian time. And the judge replied, if you wish, Mr. Ellsberg, to speak at a more convenient time, you'll have to fly him to London so he's in the right time. That was the judge's response. And not only that, they sent him, the court was to send him the bundle of papers on which he was to comment. The court sent him that bundle of 600 pages, 12 hours before he could gosh. So he got it in Canada in the early evening and had to be up to give evidence at 5:30 the next morning. And Dan Ellsberg, at the age of 89, sat up all night mastering the material. And the next day he schooled the defense counsel on what it said. And when he was asked he schooled the counsel for the United States government on what it said. And when the counsel for the United States government tried to get him to admit that people must have been harmed by the WikiLeaks revelations, he gave the answer I just explained to you about the number of people who had died as a result of US illegal war. And when the counsel for the United States government tried to make a distinction and say, but you did not reveal any names that could harm anyone, he said, that's nonsense. I revealed loads of names in the Pentagon paper. He said, I even revealed the name of one of my best friends who was a CIA agent. And I wondered whether I should do that or not. I agonized over it, and I decided in the interest of truth, I had to do it. So the attempt to make a distinction on those grounds between Julian Assange and me is false. And Dan, we miss him. He was a great man and a powerful force for good. And that performance at his age at 5:30 in the morning with so little preparation time was wonderful. It was absolutely fantastic. That's one of the things that gives me hope. You know, the power of good, moral people to show up these idiots for the kind of vicious and nasty thugs that they are, with no intellectual respectability to their case. But that's the kind of trick that was played again and again and again by the prosecution in the case in the UK. And it led me to believe, and I cannot but believe, that there is no kind of genuine judicial process here. I have lost all faith. This is in any kind of judicial dealing. The last judgment of the High Court, which was against Julian's appeal, was delivered by a judge named Judge Swift, who became a judge quite recently, and who previously was a barrister who specialised in working for the security services, who were his major clients. And he's on record as saying the security services were his favourite clients because they were always in the right. And that's the judge. Julian's last appeal to the High Court consisted of 150 pages, written by some of the greatest lawyers in the world, led by Gareth Peirce, which is a name which is magical to human rights lawyers. And the judge dismissed them. Swift dismissed the legal arguments in 3 pages of A4, in judgment on 150 pages. And he said he didn't bother to answer. He just did not bother to address the arguments there. He said they were badly set out and followed no known laws of pleading. And he then said that the permission to appeal was refused, and they could go to a 2-judge panel to appeal against his decision and ask for permission to appeal, but any submission must be limited to 20 sides of their report, and the hearing would be limited to 30 minutes. And that's 30 minutes for both defence and prosecution. So this is obviously a summary process. This is not a process where there's the least intention of giving fair hearing to the arguments. So I fear we could end up quite soon in a position where Julian is actually extradited. We continue to try to fight in the UK. We'll continue to fight the legal battle. Julian's lawyers remain convinced that their arguments are legally sound. And I don't doubt their arguments are legally sound. What I do doubt is whether that makes any difference. And if that fails, they'll try to go to the European Court of Human Rights and get a stay on extradition. And again, I don't doubt they may be able to do that, but whether it's respected and whether there's not an immediate move to whisk Julian from the courtroom onto a plane, handcuffed and blindfolded and brought here, we will have to see. I fear for the worst. If Julian is brought here, the battle moves here. And that's where, as I say, I do have a certain hope, because I do feel there's a kind of sleeping giant among the American people. I do feel that many people, and I think it's important to say here, I think people both on the left and on the right have a respect for the First Amendment. Yeah. It's actually the people in the middle who don't. But I do think that the chance of a powerful coalition of people attempting to defend the First Amendment exists. I do think the grounds for powerful legal defence in the United States exist, but I think the political pressure to be brought in an election year is even more important here than the legal defence. And I must say, I'm going to get a little more controversial to finish, because why not? I've nearly got to the end, and I can run away now if you get too angry. For me, I know all about Donald Trump. I'm not naive. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I'm not quite sure that America fully understands what it looks like to other nations when you are attempting to jail the principal opposition candidate before the election. That is not what actual democracies do. And to what extent is this an actual democracy, where your actual democratic choice is between voting for the red conservative or voting for the blue conservative? That's more or less the choice.
The red fascist and the blue fascist.
Yeah, I think that's it.
It's all about
and whether whether the Biden administration really wants a situation where at the same time it is trying to jail their political opponent and trying to jail the most famous publisher in the world. That doesn't make you look like the greatest democracy in the world. That makes you look like the biggest fascist dictatorship in the world. That really is not a good look. I think we need to motivate people against that. And I also want to address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that the core Democrat, there are two forces active against Julian. There are the security services who hate the fact that he released so many secrets about the United States and intruded on their domain, and they especially hated the CIA Vault 7 leaks, which published by Wikipedia, detailing all the dirty tricks the CIA is up to, and detailing the plans and the methods used to spy on American citizens in their own homes, even through their television sets and telephones and all such things. So the security services hate Julian and they are behind it. But also, of course, among the Democrats, there are still those who believe that the ludicrous Russiagate narrative, which has been totally exploded, but who blame WikiLeaks for the 2016 election. And we have to face that. You know, that's the elephant in the room. It's not often talked of. And the 2016 election has nothing whatsoever to do with the charges against Julian, but that is the motivation of many of the Biden people for hating Julian and wanting to destroy him. Now, when I'm asked about this, I have two answers. And my first answer is that WikiLeaks were given not by Russia, were given the Clinton emails. And what did the Clinton emails show? They showed that Hillary was giving speeches to Goldman Sachs at $150,000 a time, and in those speeches she was saying, look, I have to say in public things about how I'm going to help the working class, but don't worry, I don't mean it. Yeah. And a private agenda, and actually I'm with you guys. Well, surely there was a moral, having been given that information, there was a moral duty on WikiLeaks to reveal that so people knew exactly how duplicitous, so people knew the trick that she was trying to play upon the American people. That, for me, it's a no-brainer there was a moral duty to publish that. And the other thing, of course, that was published were the DNC emails, which showed that the primary election was deliberately gerrymandered against Bernie Sanders. And for me, also, there was a moral obligation to publish that. And it's not WikiLeaks' fault in any way that the Democrats lost the 2016 election. The Democrats lost the 2016 election because they chose Hillary Clinton as their candidate. And she got followed person. That's what the vicious war who wanted to go to war in Syria in an extravagant way. It would have killed millions of people and could quite possibly have led to nuclear war.
She went into Libya with Obama's.
Well, in fact, she went into Libya and she wanted to do the same in Syria. And that's the second part of what I would say, which is that I'm 64 years old. My heart is not in great condition. That's why I had to drink whiskey. And it cannot be too many more years before I meet my maker. And when I meet him, he will say to me, Craig, you led a really interesting life. And you did some good things, but there's a lot of whiskey and women in your life. Why should I let you in? And I will say to him, you know, I may have in some small way helped stop Hillary Clinton becoming president. I think that's my best chance of getting into heaven. So I don't shy away from the 2016 point. We have to address it because it's not in our interest in a way to address it in a sense. It's in our interest to emphasise that this is not, none of the charges has anything to do with 2016. But it is what motivates our enemy. And we do have to address it. We have to be honest about it. And the answer is, quite simply, Russia had nothing whatsoever to do with it, and I assure you of that. And damning information was given to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks published it. And I have no doubt whatsoever that had they received damning information on Donald Trump, they would have published that too. But they didn't. They did not receive it. It's not they received someone withheld it. They did not receive any. It was not a question of choosing a side. It was, you have got this extremely damning material. Do you publish it or do you keep it secret from the public? And I believe they did the right thing and publish it. So I am perfectly prepared to address that one head on. But it does lead to a situation where we have a governing class, if you like, who hate Julian, and we have the added complication to that they are currently engaged in full-on pursuit of a proxy war, which threatens the future of the whole world, quite literally. Nobody seems to be taking seriously the danger that this could spill over into nuclear war. That I find astonishing. And nobody seems to be seriously... I'm a former diplomat. This could have been settled before it started by ceding Crimea. And in Crimea, this is not necessarily true in the Donbass incident, because the Donbass has always been very split. The urban population is strongly Russian. The rural population, which is much more diffuse and thus less easily gets to express its opinion, is much more Ukrainian. Simply fact, the urban population of Donbass has always been Ukrainian speaking, but the rural population, the urban population has always been Russian speaking, the rural population has always been Ukrainian speaking. So the Donbass is a slightly complex question. It's a very complex question. The Ukraine is not complex. In the Ukraine, I have no reason to disbelieve that the large majority of the population would prefer to be Russian. In the Crimea, I do apologize. In the Crimea, a large portion of the population would prefer to be Russian. A diplomatic solution was always available, whereby Russia would obtain Crimea, and there would be some kind of special relationship with the Donbass, along the line of the Minsk II Accords, probably a bit strengthened with the demilitarized zone. And one thing I predict to you now is that something along those lines is where we are going to end up. Something along those lines is what will eventually be agreed in 2 or 3 years' time, either as a formal agreement or in terms of a frozen conflict, and that's where it lies. The idea of either side winning total victory by military means is not possible. It would involve millions of deaths. And it would involve the possibility of nuclear war. Peace is always better than war. There is always a possibility for a diplomatic resolution. And there can be a diplomatic resolution in the Ukraine. But that, of course, is not in the interest of the military-industrial complex, because victory is not the aim of the military-industrial complex. War is the aim of the military-industrial complex. And so then, the longer the war lasts, the more billions and tens of billions and tens of billions is fed into the war machine for people to make profit, for people to make money out of people dying. And it's never the people making the money who are the people who are dying. That is also the backdrop to this whole thing, because it's the people who are actively promoting war who are the enemies of Julian. And Julian stated, my favourite quote from Julian, if wars can be started by lies, then wars can be ended by truth. And that's absolutely right. And to try to rescue from persecution somebody whose major attribute is that they're the world's leading opponent of war, at a time when the powers that be are determined to pursue war, is again difficult. This is the situation which we are trying to overcome. These are the forces which are arrayed against us. So the fight for Julian is a fight for truth, it's a fight for justice, it's a fight for the very principle of freedom of speech, and it's a fight for freedom and a fight against war. And these are the fundamental virtues in society that good people should be pursuing. I shall be continuing to pursue that, and I know that everyone here will be doing that with me. Thank you very much indeed.
Mention one other little thing about Craig. Yesterday I was a nervous wreck because his plane was delayed 3 times, and finally, towards hours after he was sitting in the airport, it was canceled. Then we got another message later on that it was not only canceled, but could not be rescheduled until tomorrow. Not today, tomorrow. And Craig went and stood, he calls it a queue, he stood in a line for 2.5 hours just to get a chance at standby to fly to Charlotte in the night, and then he went from Charlotte to here. He got in last night at 1 a.m. After what, 12 hours plus. Not quite, you didn't have to read 600 pages, luckily, like Dan Ellsberg. But, this is the kind of effort, again, that we applaud and thank you. The Women Against Military Madness, the Assange Defense Committee, and our Tackling Torture group are all so happy we had this chance. I do want to make one quick announcement. Craig is going to talk in the belly of the beast in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday with another torture whistleblower, John Kiriakou, yes, Max Blumenthal, and a couple others. Woo. And, so we hope that event goes just as well as this. If you do want to donate to this cause of trying to keep a First Amendment, a little bit of freedom of speech, and trying this effort of helping Julian Assange, there's a fire truck. My grandson's fire truck is out there. I've got creative. And so please donate. And also, there was one other announcement I wanted to mention. Some of us are going to protest at Camp Ripley this Saturday. And the reason is they're part of that.
Sunday.
Oh, Sunday. Sorry, Sunday. And it's part of that military, what Ray McGovern calls the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, because they're training the people to do the drone, to conduct the drone assassinations. So some of us, if you're interested at all, there's we're Vets for Peace, Women Against Military Madness. Talk to Roger, myself, Sue Ann Martinson in the back. Some of us are trying to organize carpools. And is there anything I left out, Sarah? Oh, there's more egg rolls. But before that, we're going to have a discussion.
And I'm going to put a microphone here, not for him. He can hear whoever comes up here, but maybe some of you can't hear the person asking the question in the back. If you don't need to use this, fine, but I'm going to just put it up here in the middle. So if you want to come up here, and our sound man back there is going to turn it on, you can use this so everyone can hear your question. Is that all right with you to get asked a few questions?
Absolutely.
All right. He's going to turn it on. So does anyone want to ask? Oh.
This is more of a comment, but I know someone who said, you can, after what a lot of the things you said tonight, you cannot be too cynical for the reality we live in.
I have a quick question. So after what you said about like the decisions that have gone against Julian, it sounds like in the UK they would just assume he died a slow death. So it surprises me that he hasn't already been extradited. You know, the US wants him here. So what's the justification for keeping him in the UK?
Is there any other questions? I'll take three at once if there's... On the first thing, yes, you can't be too cynical. I agree. And if you think of the worst possible motivation of government, it's usually worse than that. But on the other hand, I think there's still a tremendous force of hope in human nature, and a tremendous amount of goodness in individual people. And I still, despite everything, I still believe in that. I do believe power structures are abused by the bad people in society, and the people who rise to the top of power structures are bad people. That's why they want to be at the top of power structures. But I do believe in the general goodness of human life, and that keeps me going. I would say that's in the wisdom. On the point of why Julian hasn't been extradited already, these are the questions we keep asking ourselves. There was this, when he submitted his appeal, which is the 150-page long appeal, there was a delay of about 15 months. We were expecting a hearing on the appeal to be called within about 3 months. Instead, we had this delay of over a year. And then I thought, well, the reason for this to delay is that Biden doesn't actually want him here before the election, because it's a difficult and complicated matter which may not play well for Biden. But then suddenly, this bang, bang, bang decision came out saying no, dismissed, 20 pages appeal, half an hour, that's it. 6 weeks. And then it seemed they were going extremely quickly. And then it slowed down again. And it's very hard. And the answer is we don't know. We don't know. I was talking to someone in New York a couple of days ago with a lot of their senior contacts in Washington. And they said that this was actually part of an internal battle between basically the security services who want him here and Biden's political advisors who don't at the moment. And that sometimes one is on top and sometimes the other on top. And that appears to be a kind of simple rationalization. But I'm just not sure. I'm really not. But I will say that he's in the maximum security business. He's in terrible conditions in the maximum security business. So the delay is no problem to them. They've already, to that extent, achieved the main thing of what they want. But the kind of capricious nature of it, maybe the capricious nature of it is also delivered to destroy your spirit, just this pure exhibition of power. We can go fast, we can go slow, there's nothing we can do.
I wonder if you could comment on, and perhaps if you followed this or not,
SCL Corporation, Cambridge Analytica, both British-based, both of whom were really involved in election interference, not on behalf of Putin, but as Israeli newspapers regularly report on behalf of Trump and on behalf of Netanyahu, and that might have really been the conspiracy to get Trump elected, having nothing to do with Russia, but using Russia as a scapegoat. And the second part of the question would be is, how is it that people think that Trump is ever in any way sympathetic to Julian Assange, or it was Trump that escalated the charges that's up against him up through the Espionage Act, and yet people had the ludicrous idea that Trump might pardon him, even though it was Trump responsible for having him facing these much more serious charges.
On the Cambridge Analytica question, Cambridge Analytica is very interesting because if you look at the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, the ownership is actually a group of very senior British aristocrats. There are dukes on there. Quite extraordinary thing. Although I would say, and the links between Cambridge Analytica and Russia proved to be fake and non-existent, and what this woman, Carol Cadwalader, had invented them, in effect, as several court cases have shown. It's not, in a sense, Cambridge Analytica who were false. They were to some extent. But Facebook was selling Cambridge Analytica private, non-public data from Facebook users for Cambridge Analytica to base their targeting software upon. And I think the role of Facebook in that was appalling and shocking and hasn't been sufficiently highlighted. But I mean, I'm not terribly excited about it, to be honest. I would be very, very surprised if there wasn't similar stuff happening on both sides. And it's part of this kind of social media targeting of individuals through analysis of what's likely to trigger them and bring their support. I think that's unfortunately how elections are going to be run in future increasingly. On the second point, no, I agree entirely. There's been no sign of any support to Julian from Donald Trump since the days when Trump thought it was a popular slogan to help him get elected back in 2016. Ever since then, he has been unremittingly hostile. There's never been any sign that Trump was prepared to give a pardon. I think that was something of a wild goose chase. Although there was evidence given in the extradition hearing that a message was conveyed to Julian from Donald Trump to say that if Julian would give up the source of the Hillary emails in order to prove it wasn't Russia, then Trump would pardon Julian. And Julian replied, "We never give up a source under any circumstances." So there was that one, but that wasn't Trump supporting Julian. That was Trump wanting something for his own advantage that would help him in the election campaign, or would help him in future election campaigns. So, but yes, the idea that there's any kind of thing. One thing that astonishes me is that the Roger Stone narrative, which keeps coming up. Roger Stone was imprisoned for lying to the FBI. But his lie to the FBI was that he was a back channel to WikiLeaks, where actually he had no connection to WikiLeaks at all. And yet it's always reported in the media as though Roger Stone's conviction proved the link between Trump and WikiLeaks. There was no link between Trump and WikiLeaks. And Stone was convicted for inventing one, not for being one. People don't know that because it's never been reported that way, quite deliberately by the media.
I wasn't suggesting that Hillary Clinton's hands are clean. She was using the same sort of methods as we saw in her charges of election interference, etc. So I'm not defending the Democrats.
No, I didn't think you were. I didn't think you were. But yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Well, and election denial was a big thing in 2016.
What do you think of the Schiller Institute, inspired by the thinking of Roach, and their support of BRICS?
The first thing to say is I know next to nothing about the thinking of the Roach. I'm not in the least expert on the subject. About 5 years ago, I spoke at something that the Schiller Institute invited me to speak at online. I can't remember what the conference was on. And I gave a big speech on whatever the subject was. And then I had about 200 people email me to say, what are you doing? These people are mad. They're cults. Don't have anything to do with it. And the conference they had organised and the subject they asked me to speak on was perfectly sensible. And they did nothing to me, or I witnessed nothing that gave me any worries about them. But plainly other people do have worries about them. And to be perfectly blunt, I have many things happening in my life and I've never researched it. So I just don't know. What I saw of them was unobjectionable, that there's something about them that other people object to, and I've never really researched what it is. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but that's true. So I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your...
Well, their support of BRICS.
BRICS is BRICS, I think, BRICS is a symptom, if you like. BRICS is an inevitable consequence of the failing of US economic hegemony, because US economic hegemony is undoubtedly, as a matter of fact, disintegrated. And those countries that stand outside the US economic orbit and stand outside of US political and diplomatic influence were bound to want to eventually organize institutionally themselves into some kind of alternative diplomatic grouping. If it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it. And I think that the fact that so many other countries are now seeking to join BRICS is simply a reflection of that, and the fact that if you're African, for example, you're much more likely to get capital to develop from China now than you are to get it from the United States. Now, I must say, someone who worked in African development for much of my career, I find some of the criticisms of China in this regard amazingly hypocritical. People are saying, wow, this is terrible. China is building infrastructure in Africa, but it's doing it by giving loans that the Africans will never be able to repay. What the hell has the West been doing for the last 100 years? Absolutely astonishing, the hypocrisy and lack of self-knowledge behind some of the criticisms of the economic development of the BRICS countries. And I think it's very, very significant that diplomacy on Ukraine, which is happening in Ankara and is happening in Beijing. It's not happening in Washington or New York. And that's, in a sense, what the future looks like. And I think the move to abandon the dollar as the universal currency of exchange, and that move will be increasingly pioneered by the BRICS countries. I think that spells a fundamental debt to continuing economic dominance by the US financial system. So I genuinely don't know what the Bush Foundation's attitude to BRICS is, but my attitude to BRICS is that it is the future, and it's coming. And it may be it takes slightly different institutional forms than BRICS, which is a kind of first flourishing, but it's inevitable. The balance of power in the world has shifted, and that's unstoppable.
When you're as good at hypocrisy as the United States, I call it hypercritical. But an ambassador and a diplomat, you brought up Daniel Ellsberg, I just want to throw out Richard Holbrooke. And Richard Holbrooke had a massive heart attack in Hillary Clinton's office, and his dying words were, "We've got to get out of Afghanistan." So Mr. Richard Holbrooke, who knew what he had to do. But a couple of things that you said. The reason why Julian Assange is still being held in torture is because they can't risk discovery. I was sued by the military-industrial complex and the intelligence community in 2002, and I'm one of the only people that ever won a case. But just because I won doesn't mean that that's when things really went south for me. And I've had 2 U.S. senators forced to vacate their seats, and everybody that attacked me from the Justice Department to the FBI ended up getting promotions within the government and in the private sector. But I wanted to clarify a couple of things that you mentioned. And you mentioned that Julian Assange is the only person that has had the intelligence community have their lawyers spied on by the government. That's not true. And I just want to, because they've been doing that for decades. And a simple Google search went Obama, who has a senator promised to filibuster Section 215 immunity and 702 from FISA, and then ended up utilizing the Espionage Act more than any other presidents combined, made this promise to the American people, then turned the machinery on us. But a 15-second Google search, Obama, FDA, EPA whistleblowers, where he investigated not only the FDA and the EPA whistleblowers, but their attorneys and the general counsel. So there's a simple fix to all of this, and that's daylight, but we cannot trust. In 2006, I was interviewed by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by 60 Minutes, and they all told me my story was too complicated. And, you know, thank you and God bless you for what you're doing. But I just want to remind people, there's another whistleblower that we need to talk about, and his name is Michael Hastings. And if you've never heard of Mike, show of hands, Michael Hastings, anybody? Okay, he's the whistleblower. He's the journalist that outed David Petraeus and McChrystal. And then he wrote an article called "Why Democrats Love to Spy on the American People." And a week later, he was dead. So I could go on about what happens to actual whistleblowers. They don't have to kill you to kill you.
I don't disagree. I don't have to pass that. I don't think I said that Julian was the only person who had his lawyers spied on by. If I did say that,
That's just institutional.
I'm wrong.
I really appreciate your honesty, you and your courage. And it takes courage to talk about elephants in the room, and you talked about several of them. And I'm curious what the response has been to people, to audiences, you know, that you've given talks to around the country. I think you're speaking to possibly the most politically aware group that you would find in the Twin Cities here. So we weren't horrified for the most part, I don't think. But I'm curious what you think, what's the sense of things, of attitudes around the country?
I think mixed. On this particular tour, this last few days, the audiences I've been speaking to are quite similar to you. I've not been giving talks to your university audiences. So, and to some extent, I confess, I do modulate what I'm saying to the particular audience. And I do that as I go along, so I kind of sense what you're making of what I just said. I think, can I say this one, or will they kill me? No, I mean, I spent a very uncomfortable 5 minutes in New York after being browbeaten by a lady after he was talking, who was very, very upset that I didn't think Donald Trump should immediately be put in prison. So it's very difficult. And America is not a functional political community. People are irrationally divided, and they've taken a side, and they believe everything about the other side is evil, everything about their side is good. And once you have people believing that, you're out of the realms of logic, and you're out of the realms of rationality, and into the realms of blind belief, and of opposing blind beliefs, which can only lead to conflict. So it's extremely hard to talk about these things in the United States at the moment. And if I were an American, I might have the excuse of being a Scotsman who's blundering around, and so people maybe give me a latitude they wouldn't give to an American making the same points. But it is difficult to say these things with audiences, when you're meant to be either entirely pro-Trump or entirely anti-Trump, or you're meant to be a Democrat or a Republican. If you're not one or the other, there's something weird about it. And you have so many lovely people, like Cornel West is trying to stand for that. There ought to be. How bad does your society have to be before Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the best people? It cannot be a national order of society. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy, for taking all the trouble to be here with us. Appreciate that. I always wanted to ask a Brit, is Britain subservient to the United States, or are they working in tandem? Because I've often wondered that. Because the reason I ask that is because I think Tony Blair was a pawn to Dick Cheney and George W. Bush.
Well, I should say, fortunately, I'm in a very good mood. But I'm a Scottish nationalist. You can't call me a bit. But I think the UK is entirely subservient. I think it is a relationship of subservience. It's not an equal relationship of give and take. And that's to do with the decline of the British Empire and the fall of the UK impeding to go down and down. And the UK is kind of latched on to the United States in order to be the best end of the big bully in the school. That's the kind of relationship which I would think that. I don't think there's any. I think the ability of the UK to influence US government policy on any matter is almost nil, whereas the opposite way it's enormous. So I don't think it's any kind of relationship. No, I don't.
Question. This is about freedom of press, but were there any repercussions for the Financial Times when you reported torture in Uzbekistan?
No, not at all. No. The Financial Times published the information, and there was never any idea that the government would take action against them. I don't think it was even considered. And that shows how far we've moved in a sense. But equally, there was no thought. The same things which Chelsea Manning revealed, which WikiLeaks published, were also published by The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And there's no idea of any reaction against them at all. And one of the reasons I think that we haven't had the support we should have from the media is that the media thinks, oh, well, this would never happen to us anyway. Yes, maybe it's a terrible precedent, but actually, they're never going to do it to us because we are part of the establishment. And that may be something they come to regret. I'll take, I think that's okay with politically.
Yeah, right.
I'll take 3 more questions all at once, and then I'll answer them all at once, and then I think we'll go to a close.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much for coming to our little Midwest city. It was a really inspiring speech. I really thank you very much. So just, I guess, a comment and a question. A comment that you mentioned that there's people on the left that support free speech, and I'm just not quite sure that's true. I think we might not be able to find more people that are anti-free speech right now than the left in the U.S. But I'm wondering, what do you think that is the most that a typical American citizen can do right now to support Julian and to support press freedom in the U.S.?
Thank you so much. You spoke about how Julian Assange has been maligned, to have created, and when he released it to The Guardian, and he was nervous when New York Times came along, and then when The Guardian editors, Alan Rusbridger, wrote this book about him, it was, at first it was this visionary, and now, because he does journalism in public interest, what they did so effectively was to then call him, he's not a source because Chelsea Manning is a source. He wasn't given any journalistic control about the order in which to release the information, which focused too heavily on the US, and they were able to then, tar him by calling him an amateur and building all of that. So I just was wondering if you could talk about how culpable the gatekeeping function of journalism here has been. And of course, Julian Assange speaks about that.
Thank you for coming to me this morning. After Julian was so rudely extracted from the Ecuadorian embassy, did his cat find an adopted home?
I'll answer the last one first, because I have two cats myself. I'm big old cats. And the embassy cat, it's called, lives now with Stella in her home in London, and is still in the Assange family, and regularly sits on my lap. So the cat is fine. It's giving me important. On the question of The Guardian, yes, it's quite astonishing, because and the long part of the answer about danger to individuals is that WikiLeaks was going through this enormous, careful process of editing. It took over a year, where they were expunging names, and they were working with journalists, and they called in journalists from different media organizations to join them, because they were having to edit out things which may get people killed or hurt, and they invited in organizations which had specialist knowledge that they didn't have, which would help them do that. And then The Guardian, the New York Times, and partner organizations were publishing things, and all the pressure was from The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post, Der Spiegel. All the pressure was on WikiLeaks to publish things quicker. Forget all this redaction. Why are you protecting it? Just get it out there, because there's money in this. And those newspapers all made a fortune out of the Chelsea Manning regulations, which they only got through Julian. And their criticism of Julian was that he was too cautious. That was their criticism at the time. And Julian, of course, even phoned the Department of Defense in Washington and asked if they wanted to help in redacting anything that may put lives in danger. But then the precipitation of the unredacted material was actually caused by a book published by the deputy editor of The Guardian, David Lee, and famous MI6 asset Luke Harding, who jointly published a book on WikiLeaks in which they gave the password to the encrypted files as a chapter head. And they did that as a joke to show how clever they were, with the idea that nobody would work that out. And the text of the chapter was all about the encrypted files and how that was done and how they were put up into a central cache that anyone could access, but that only certain privileged people like The Guardian had the password. And then they put the password as a chapter heading, thinking, ho, 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 no one will twig this, like school books, aren't we clever? Until, of course, someone did. It took about a year, but eventually somebody thought, I wonder whether that strange chapter heading is the password. And then the unredacted files came out into public. It wasn't WikiLeaks that put the unredacted files into public. It was The Guardian. And again, all the evidence of that was given in the extradition hearing. And that, that's astonishing, their level of culpability, their willingness to make as much money as they possibly could. And I should say as well, the initial big falling out between The Guardian and WikiLeaks was over the fact that The Guardian wanted to dig out. At the time, Julian was the most famous person in the world. It's hard to think back to how esteemed and revered he was back in 2006. And The Guardian wanted to ghostwrite, Luke Harding in particular, ghostwrite his biography, for which they would have made millions personally. And Julian decided he didn't trust them and didn't want them to do it. And it was an argument over money for his biography, which is what led to the initial split. So, yeah, they made a fortune by increased circulations out of the revelations. They themselves released the unredacted material by publishing the password, and then they engaged in massive character assassination of Julian ever since. And it's sordid and disgusting, but that's the medium. And finally, on the question of what people can do, every little bit helps. Speaking to your congressman helps. You may think it doesn't, but it does. It all cumulatively adds up. Writing letters. If Julian is extradited here, on the day that happens, it will be the biggest news story in the world, and it will lead every local and national news bulletin in the USA and in most of the world. We need, on that day, immediately to affect the narrative. We need people here in Minnesota to be on your local, to be available to all your local media. We need the alternative media to pump out the truth. We also need, on the mainstream media, all your local media, to have available people who will go on and put the other side of the story, and put over the kind of points I've been making today. And we need alternative visuals. They will have perfect pictures of Julian possibly in an orange suit or something, throwing off the plane in handcuffs. We need people to be on the street at an agreed location here in Minneapolis, giving local media something they can photograph or video to give countervailing images of the other side of the subject and people prepared to give countervailing talk. And all this could be quite interesting, as I say. Continued normal, rather dull activist campaigning involving writing letters, doing the odd demonstration, trying to get what publicity you can, but preparedness to leap into action should the extradition actually happen. And as I say, it's difficult sometimes, particularly when you're dealing with the judicial authorities, it's difficult to maintain optimism. It's difficult to maintain belief in good and truth. But then you realise what a resource we have in decent people. And I do believe most people in this world are decent people. The difficulty is they're subject to manipulation. But I believe if we can counter that manipulation, we really can win in the end. Thank you very much.